Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us today in this first online event for the chapter on labor and social movements, relationship, tensions and contradictions. Before starting this event, I would like to take a moment to remember Dan Galin, one of the most exceptional organic intellectuals of the labor movement, who passed away last week. With an unmatchable knowledge of the history of labor movements in almost any country and a life dedicated to the cause of the working people, Dan will hold forever a remarkable place in the debates about an emancipatory vision of labor internationalism and the struggle for a more just world. And Dan was absolutely passionate about labor history and considered that to be critical, that claiming the roots of the labor movement critical to actually thinking about this emancipatory vision of the labor movement. And it is in that spirit that we continue our conversations about labor history. And today, we are extremely honored to have with us Dorothy Sue Cobble, Professor Emerita of History and Labor Studies at Rutgers University in the US, and with whom we are going to discuss the question of how has the history of labor feminism shaped the labor movements, and have also some reflections and discuss some prospects. So Dorothy, thank you so much for joining us early in the morning. Let me start with the first question, just to kickstart the conversation, and then the comrades that are joining us, of course, would give the floor to them for questions that they may have. You can do so, comrades, by either putting in the chat box or taking the floor, so whatever you prefer. And of course, if possible, please turn your cameras on so we can see as many faces as possible. So in your contribution to the Labor History Online course, you discussed the critical role of labor feminists in the struggle for the rights of women and workers. You argue that this early generation of labor feminists championed a far-seeing politics of sex and class justice that is going beyond achieving sex equality with low-income men and instead fighting for universal rights and protection for all workers. Reflecting on that history, how did this wave of labor feminism and their politics transform the labor movement?
Thank you for that question. Hello, everybody. I'm looking forward to talking to you today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Sometimes I feel like that's the most interesting thing is to hear from other people, because what I'm going to say, I've written about a lot and have thought about a lot, but I'm looking forward to learning from you. And also thinking with you about how to strengthen movements for justice and progress. It's meaningful for me in an America now that's quite right wing and moving toward authoritarianism and increasingly isolated, that I can be with you today and cross borders, even if electronically. I wanted to thank Peter and Adlira and everybody who's really made this course happen and who keep the Global Labor University moving forward. Thank you for the work that you do. It's really important. And Adlira told me a bit about who's on the call today. Many of you are working very hard across the world in labor organizations and activist groups. And so I wanted to thank you for the work that you do too. I'm really honored to be with you today. And again, I look forward to learning from you. I just wanted to add a bit to what Lyra said about who I am before I start talking a bit about the things I've written about. I have been at Rutgers for 30 years, where I taught both workers in trade unions and activist groups, and also undergraduates and graduate students. Before that, I had a lot of very bad jobs, I would say. A few good ones. Those were mainly the unionized jobs. But I had a range of jobs. I was a waitress for a long time, which is the job most women have held, I think. File clerk, I was a teamster. I think a high point for me was in my 20s when I was able to work in the International Longshore and Warehouse Union for a couple of years and work as a ship scaler and stevedore. So a lot of my research comes out of my own work experiences. Um, and I also think that I was attracted to writing about labor feminists and working class women's politics um, because there was so much misunderstanding about working class women when I was in graduate school. So I just wanted to say a few words about why I study the women that I do and labor feminism and social movements more broadly before I really talk about what their impact was and what they accomplished. I went to graduate school in the late 70s and 80s. And as I said, I had a lot of jobs and I grew up in a blue collar family. And what I was taught made no sense to me. And I think it's really important that we challenge conventional wisdoms and challenge what we're taught. So, learning from people who've written these books, written books like I've written, but also going beyond what we've said and challenging and move on. So, some of my teachers, and I think the dominant understanding, was that working class women did not have much of an impact on history. They were absent. Uh, the notion was that there were these great men, giants among them, among us, who were smarter than all of us and all the rest. It's a kind of social Darwinist vision. And these were the people who determined history. Ordinary people didn't have much of an impact, and particularly working class women, because they weren't really in the important realms in the public arena. They were just in the home. And you didn't really, there wasn't much written about them. Women's history and the rise of social history more generally made a big difference. But unfortunately, a lot of my fellow feminist historians had a kind of great woman's history, I would say. So they left out working class women as well. A lot of the new work that was in labor history at the time focused on either the male-led movements, labor movements, or the elite-led women's movements. Working class women were absent. They were also misunderstood and mischaracterized. As you can imagine, it's hard to know what people fought for, what their politics were, if you didn't even know that they were activists. So it was thought that working class women were conservative. They were too focused on the family. Uh, they weren't feminists because they didn't care enough about careers. They were opposed to unions. In fact, I took a couple of courses in the economics department and in the industrial relations department. And the idea then, and I'll never forget this because I was so outraged by it, was that, yeah, unions are dead. You know, it was the 1980s, it was America, there was the decline of unions. And why was that? Well, it was because there were more working women in the labor force. and working women didn't join unions. And so the more women you have at work, the fewer unions you're going to have. So I spent my career kind of talking back to this conventional wisdom. None of it squared with my experiences. So yes, women did organize, but they didn't organize in the same ways that men did. And that's one of the reasons why they were invisible. They were organizing often around different issues. They were organizing in groups that weren't recognized as real unions. They might have been in women's auxiliaries where basically they weren't even counted as union members or working women's associations. Um, so they were active, they were organizing. They also were not conservative. And here again, I went against many of my feminist colleagues who, in fact, said that many working class women were anti-feminists. Why? In part because they didn't agree with what I call the sex only agenda of many feminist movements, just like they rejected the class only agenda of many trade union movements historically. They cared about the rights of workers and women, as Ed Lira just summarized. They cared about raising the wage floors for all women, not and particularly those at the bottom, not just achieving equal pay, for example, but raising the wages for all. They also challenged capitalism. They didn't want to just assimilate into it. They wanted to transform it. So they were very much a different kind of feminism than, say, the lean-in feminism of corporate women that became dominant in America um, a couple of, 10 years ago or so, the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world. They were opposed to women being second-class citizens. That's why I consider them feminists. But they're labor feminists because they cared about the issues of working class people, men and women. In what you read, both in the video that I summarized and the paper that hopefully you will look at if you haven't, I really um, detail two areas where labor feminism had the most impact. The first was suffrage, and I chose that because I wanted to talk about the ways in which working class women transformed politics and made it possible for women and workers to participate more fully in politics historically. The second area was labor standards, and I chose that because I wanted to talk about more how working class women had transformed the economic arenas. So I can detail a bit about both of those, but I don't know how I'm doing with time, Ed Lira. You want me to continue a bit?
Yeah, I mean, we can just ask everyone if somebody would like to step in and ask a particular question, but if not, we can go back to. So is there somebody that would like a question on what? First of all, thank you so much. Really, really thank you for this very insightful, also distinction in between the different waves of feminism and different strands. Would somebody like to make a question? You can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat box, whatever is easier. And please, in between, do also put in the chat where you are writing from and which organization you are. If not, we can perhaps to Dorothy go ahead, and then, oh, Gifford, yes, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Gifford Hartman. I actually live in San Francisco and was also a former member of ILWU, the longshore worker, but in Local 6, the warehouse division in
Yeah,
the
you know
90s.
that well.
And so my question is related to San Francisco. And I read in your book, Dishing It Out, and this is an amazing statistic that in 1941, in the culinary unions here, 95% of the workers were organized. And I believe that was part of the upsurge of the 30s. We have the building of the CIO, we have the waterfront strike here in San Francisco that led to the 1934 general strike, which is one of the video lectures by Peter Cole in the labor history course here at Global Labor University. But could you talk again about that relationship? As the men were striking at the docks, it was almost all men, and the waitresses and the restaurant and the hotel workers and like the Woolworth strike that was a little bit later in the 30s that became nationwide. Could you talk about maybe the relationship of men in heavy industry striking, but at the same time women in service industry striking, and how did they influence each other?
Thank you for that question. Ed Lira, generally you want me to respond to each question because sometimes I take a couple and then can respond more generally. I can certainly respond to that. I'm not sure how many people on the call know much about the San Francisco history, but you probably have read about general strikes that have been an important phenomena in the labor movement historically. And in the US, before we actually had government policy that backed collective bargaining, it took general strikes in San Francisco, in Minneapolis, to make that happen. So those changes in policy only came about because of militant action on the part of organized workers. Again, something that goes quite against the great man or great woman theory of history. And one of the most meaningful things to me about working on the docks in San Francisco was that the men that I worked with, and I was one of the first women, and it was quite controversial. Some of them were happy to have me there, others weren't so happy. Um, but many of them made sure that they sat me down and told me the history of their union. I didn't work before I learned about the general strike and how the longshoremen, because they went on strike, the Teamsters honored it. The whole city got behind them. And what was once casual labor and work that was not respected, was not thought of as respectable, um, became a job that people took pride in. They were well paid, they had dignity, they had control. And it happened because of the support of public in San Francisco, but also sympathetic people in the Roosevelt administration. Now, Gifford, your question has to do with a connection between uh, this industrial upsurge stimulated by the longshore and the organizing in the service industries, which were primarily women. The first book I wrote, Dishing It Out, I tried to understand how women service workers organized. First, I recognized that, in fact, they had organized. A quarter of all waitresses were in unions by the 1940s in the US. That's millions of women. It's very different today, but it's important for us to remember that it happened before and it can happen again. And then the question became, well, how did that happen? And one of the ways that happened is they had important allies. And that's something that I tried to stress in the reading for today, that working class women historically had to search for allies. And they changed their ideas of where they could find alliances over time. It wasn't always the same people. Sometimes they looked to more elite women, and they felt that this was the group in society that was most sympathetic to them. Um, the people like Rose Schneiderman that I write about, who's a garment worker, throughout her life, she kept going back and forth. Should I join with elite women? She'd try that for a while. She'd get fed up with some of the ways in which her ideas were demeaned, and women would assume that her experiences were like theirs. And then she'd go back into the trade union movement and look for allies there. In San Francisco, the longshoremen were a broad thinking, progressive organization that wanted to organize everybody who worked. They supported making San Francisco a union town. So they backed the hotel and restaurant employees and waitress unionism. But I should add one other thing here, and then I'll open it up to other questions or other comments, is that it wasn't just that waitresses and service workers were able to ally with important sectors of the already organized industrial classes, like longshoremen, like Teamsters. Of course, you can imagine how important they were. If they weren't going to deliver the bread and milk to restaurants, you certainly couldn't feed people. But these groups, and that's true today in terms of contemporary service workers, made alliances with what I call the third party, with customers, with patients, with students. When you're in a service industry, uh, what Daniel Bell used to call people work, you work with other people, and those people can be your allies in helping you secure better working conditions. The teachers currently, I think, have been very smart about that in reaching out to the communities around them, to explaining to people why raising wages and why teachers having better working conditions means better education, and it's a goal for parents, and it improves the life of children, not just teachers.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. There is a comment from Isis from Peru, but it's a comment that I don't know whether you want to pick up on that, because I think it also connected to some of the points you're making. The history of working class feminism teaches us that we must fight on several fronts. Sorry, primarily against class, society, and prevailing mechanisms, but also within the feminist movement itself against positions that exclude the specific demands of the poorest female working class. And perhaps the example from the ILO standards could speak to that. So if you want to pick up on that, or any other examples.
Sure. Um, Well, I don't want to let suffrage, I don't want that not to be mentioned. I think I'm feeling particularly passionate about that these days because I just finished a little piece on the importance of women in perpetuating and creating social democracy mid-century. And maybe I'm caring about that a lot recently since we seem to see democracy receding. But I want to make clear to people that working class women were so central for the expansion of the vote and for democratization that they had to transform male-led organizations, socialist, labor, Democratic Party, different political and labor parties. They had to convince them that their demand shouldn't be just for male suffrage, which was an incredibly important demand, as we know, throughout the 19th century. 1% of men had the vote, but they also had to transform and convince many women's suffrage organizations that equal suffrage was not enough. I went into a local bookstore the other day and they had a big pin, equal suffrage. And I had a great conversation with the clerk there because he didn't realize that actually that demand left out the majority of women. If you just demanded equal suffrage for men, then the only women who would be able to vote would be the same small percent of women that of men who voted, only the privileged women. So in many countries, that meant only white women voted if you got one equal suffrage, or only educated women. And so working class women had to expand that demand to universal suffrage. The first wave of suffrage movements did enfranchise a small slice of women, but by World War II, that's really the watershed for working class women. And by 1960s, with decolonization picking up speed, you actually had a majority of countries and territories around the world where women could vote. And my argument is that that was fundamental to the rise of social democracy, to the welfare states in the 40s and 50s, to the benefits from the state for the unemployed, for mothers, that whole transformation of the state to make it a more caring state, that women and their vote were fundamental to that. Now to get back to your point, Lyra, I did want to say just a few words about the fight for labor standards. I don't know how much people know about the ILO. Probably many of you know it's the international tripartite body. It's made up of labor representatives, employers, government, and it sets and formulates global norms. It's one of the things it does about how we treat workers. Many people say, well, it doesn't have a lot of power because it doesn't have enforcement power, but actually ideas matter and people organize once the ILO passes certain conventions, and laws in various countries around the world do change. One of the things I've written about is the first founding convention of the ILO and the first 4 conventions it passed. That history was usually told without attention to women at all, and particularly without attention to working class women. And that sort of makes sense because the first ILO convention, there were only men who had voting rights. And so that story is told as if only those men mattered. But actually, what I found out is that as the ILO was being set up in Versailles in 1919, women had gathered around the world to say, we demand attention to our needs. And obviously, one of the needs was suffrage, but also economic rights and worker rights. And there were women's labor organizations and women labor leaders who came to Versailles to agitate for women's rights. But once the ILO was set up and the first meeting was scheduled for Washington, D.C., uh, working class women, labor feminists, and their allies realized, well, this is an opportunity for us to get into the ground floor here and make sure that the labor issues and labor standards we care about are part of the ILO agenda. So they had a pre-meeting, one that's not wasn't really known about that much. The International Confederation of Working Women is what they call themselves. They met a month ahead of the official ILO conference. And why did women do that? This is something all through history that groups have done to put forward their demands and their needs. They have a pre-caucus or a pre-meeting. And they met for a week to basically unify and articulate their vision so that they could then speak about it and agitate when the official conference came around. They didn't have voting rights, but they were very effective as lobbyists and as speakers, and men changed their minds. And the first four conventions in the end were quite different than what many people thought was going to be in the beginning. There's some dramatic moments that I won't go into. One of the most dramatic moments was the speech by the Japanese woman who was part of the Japanese delegation. But at that point, she'd been asked not to speak, even though many other women were speaking. But she spoke flawless English. And so she was asked to translate the remarks of one of her male colleagues. She went before the group and pretended to translate his remarks, but then began very rapidly to speak her own mind and to talk about the need for Japan to regulate work, to not just depend on welfare capitalism and the family system that was important. And she was taken off the stage and banned, and this became a cause célèbre around the world. And so her speech was electrifying. But there were many other women who spoke as well. And this organization was global. It represented women from 19 nations and 3 continents. And I think the most important area where they changed the minds of men was in terms of maternity leave. Initially, some delegates, male delegates, thought that this wasn't an appropriate use for state funds or for labor standards, or that perhaps household labor, child rearing, that should be the responsibility of individual families, not of the state. But by the end, the first convention for maternity was very clear that at a minimum, women needed 12 weeks of paid leave. They needed nursing breaks. They needed attention to their health and the health of infants. And so that was a celebrated victory. We know this fight is not over by any means, but since 1919, there has been a worldwide movement toward recognition of maternity rights, the rights of mothers. A majority of countries offer these kind of benefits. And there's only a few, the US is one of those, where we do not have guaranteed maternity leave.
Thank you.
So I'll just leave it
Yeah,
there.
yeah, I mean, really, really fascinating stories. Thank you very much. We have a question from a comrade from Brazil. Bianca, would you like to take the floor and make the question directly? I think it'd be nice if you can.
It's okay. You can go. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I read it then. So very nice to hear, Dorothy. I'm glad for this. I work for Brazilian Maritime Trade Union. Here in Brazil, women were only allowed to work as seafarers in 2001, and women's union membership rates are considerably lower than men's rates. Do you see this? Any historical comparable trends around the world?
Yes, I've written a bit about the feminization of unions globally. And I mean, the good news is that more and more women are in the labor force, and jobs have opened up to women. And many of the unions have transformed and responded, are more interested and committed to organizing women. Women have organized themselves as well. I think the figures I looked at about 10 years ago now, when I was studying the statistics on women globally in the labor movement, was that 40% of labor union membership globally is female, and that's close to parity. And of course, we know that women have moved into leadership in many of the trade union organizations, so there's been a feminization of leadership. This is all the good news. But at the same time, and this is what my friend Ruth Milkman calls the two whirls of unionism. So you've got progressive unions, unions that are open to difference, who are making strides, and then you've got a slow track there, unions that are much more resistant. So I know that's difficult when that happens. And Bianca, I just wanted to ask more about your situation and how you're addressing it. And do you see any change happening?
Oh, we are a very progress union here. I have two colleagues that are directors here from our trade union that is watching you now. Two females, two women that are here watching us. But the thing is that the workers, the women workers, they have some resistance to come, you know. They are, Silvania and Lorena, they are watching us now. They are doing a great job to try to bring them and make women feel comfortable here, because it's a really very mainly male trade union, you know. It's very recent that they are seafarers now here in Brazil, but they are doing a great job bringing this woman, but they have some resistance. And this is a Brazilian thing overall, you know, but here in our field, I believe it's being a little bit worse.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the strategies that women have used historically, and probably people on this call can give examples from their unions too, what have been done to integrate women more thoroughly into the institution and to make them more comfortable, is organizing separate spaces that were female-only spaces where women felt more comfortable to speak, um, and where they could practice speaking and think more about what their own needs and demands were. So I think those separate spaces have been important historically. And if you look at the history, you see how um, women and other groups as well, who are minority groups, have moved back and forth between organizing um, separately as a group and working within mixed organizations. Oh, so sometimes women have organized completely independently. Other times they'll move into a mixed organization, but still have a caucus or a division. Or when I gave the example of the women at the ILO, they got together ahead of time to talk. So perhaps some of those kinds of spaces would be important. And I'd be interested in hearing other people on the call too, if you have some ideas.
Thanks very much for that exchange. And perhaps the question that, again, our comrade from Peru, Isis making is, could be in this direction. So her point is, can we affirm that there is a dialectical relationship between working class feminism and the feminist movements? A relationship of similarities and differences, a relationship between the part and the whole, but always necessary relationship for social development. So perhaps, Dorothy, if you can speak to that, to the fact that I think the point you are making, that there would be with one foot in the labor movement and one foot in the other movements, and like bringing the ideas, in both movements and making that sort of exchange.
Yeah, a lot of the women that I have written about did wear multiple hats. There's no doubt about it. And they say that first generation, the World War I generation of labor feminists, um, they were also the founders in the US of the NAACP. They were some of the early advocates for organizations on behalf of African American um, rights and an end to discrimination. Along those lines, I was just traveling up to upstate New York and on to Canada to visit a friend uh, last week. And I happened to stop at the National Women's Rights uh, Museum. And I wasn't that excited to go there at first because the story of women's rights often is told without a connection to other social movements. But in this case, I was really happy to see that it was made clear that the women's rights movement in the US grew out of the abolitionist movement before the Civil War. Indeed, I thought this was a very inspiring story of how social change can happen. 5 women who had been involved in the abolitionist movement and who were at the World Conference Against Slavery in London in 1840. They had to sit behind a curtain, the women did at the World Conference. And they were really quite angry about this, not just because they didn't have the right to speak. Of course, they were angry about that, but they were angry that they weren't able to speak about the need to end slavery. They were angry that they couldn't move forward the rights of others. So it was this combination, and I think this is part of the power of labor feminism, is that it's about the rights of women, but it's also the rights of others. And so they organized the sort of famous 1848 Seneca Rights Conference, so they could be more active in the abolitionist movement. They had women trying to speak in the abolitionist movement, and the churches wouldn't allow them in because they didn't think women should be speaking in public. That has changed. Here we all are. But it's just an example of the need. Sometimes, if you have multiple issues and multiple kinds of exploitations that you're facing, you need to organize and participate in multiple organizations. At the same time, I think it's important, particularly given the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of the right globally, that we learn to organize in big tent movements, that we unify, that we learn how to operate in coalitions where we can define issues broadly uh, enough to include a broad mass group, but we can think about how those issues might affect people differently. So they might need to be adjusted and thought about to accommodate difference. So, one of the things I write about in what you've read is how labor feminists strived to think universally, universal suffrage, universal labor protections, not just for women, but for men. But they also were clear that people are different. All of us are different. And we have to acknowledge those differences, not be afraid of them, and that those are our sources of strength. We have false unity if we suppress differences. We can only have the strongest bonds of solidarity when we recognize the individual strengths and talents of each of us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely. And perhaps, I don't know, I can't see another hand raised or another comment in the chat box. So perhaps, well, if there is one, please do. But meanwhile, and really continuing in this discussion, Dorothy, a bit of a connection to the new social movements which rose in the 60s, including some strands of feminism that I think you made a bit of mention earlier. But they were said to be post-industrial, detached from class, and supplanting the workers' movement as a source of social contestation. But the varied social insurgencies of recent decades, however, highlight the enduring silence of class and the critical importance of class analysis in rethinking the relationship of labor to social movements. Excuse me. Do you see a change now when it comes to the feminism, and how important are the lessons from labor feminism, the early generations of labor feminism for the labor feminists today?
Okay, thank you for that question. We talked a bit about what labor feminists accomplished and also some of the strategies that they used to increase their power, to increase the strength of the movements that they participated in. I think what you're really talking about and asking is if we look back in that history, what we can learn from them that would be applicable to today. And, you know, one of the reasons that I write about working class politics and write about people in the past, one of the reasons I became a historian is because I think there's an enormous amount to learn from past generations. And I think that sometimes we all too often have this sense that we're getting smarter and smarter, that our generation knows more than those in the past. It's a kind of condescension about the past, that we would never have made the mistakes they made, that we're a bit more enlightened. And I think we're enlightened in some ways and not as enlightened in others. And there will be generations in the future that look onto us and think, how did they possibly tolerate the things they tolerated? So one of the things that's great about thinking about other generations is that you're kind of moving to a different world with different assumptions and different ways of thinking. It's a sort of travel to a different country. But let me talk a bit about more specifics in terms of strategies and tactics they used that I thought were particularly creative or helpful, but also their vision, their politics. So both means and ends. One of the things I was really struck by is the creativity and the ways in which labor feminists put economic pressure on employers, not just quickie strikes and sit-ins, but things like sip-ins that the waitress unions used. I started my chapter by talking about Myra Wolfgang, who was a Detroit labor feminist in the 30s who organized the Playboy bunnies in Detroit and sex workers. And she had some innovative tactics, but also flight attendants who refused to smile or generate false happiness or cheer, what one leader called a spontaneous loss of enthusiasm. So service workers and women had their own particular ways of resisting. And also I mentioned the broader efforts of alliances with customers. Beverly Silver, who's a sociologist I really admire, her book, Forces of Labor, talk about kinds of associational power, not just structural power or power at the point of production. So you can have power by organizing in the community. You can have power by organizing in neighborhoods. You can have power through using power of consumption, what labor feminists call collective buying, not just collective bargaining. Some people might call it kitchen table politics now. So there was a sense of organizing in different ways. There was this sense of expanding where organizing took place. There was also a sense of expanding who should be in the labor movement, not just employees, but everybody who works, waged or unwaged. They sought a big tent movement. They expanded the sense of what was a labor issue. I talked about the Playboy bunnies and the organizing of the waitresses at the Playboy clubs. They ended up negotiating what women could be and required to wear at work. At first, this wasn't thought of as a serious labor issue, but they made it a serious issue because it affected their working conditions. Issues of the double day and the lack of childcare, those weren't thought of always as central to the labor movement, but labor feminists made them central. A few things about what I would call their vision or their politics. I really appreciated their flexibility of thinking. There was no one right way, no silver bullet. They realized that their strategies and tactics were going to have to vary based on time and place. So I couldn't tell you, speaking in America, what is necessarily right for organized groups outside of America. Every context is different. We can learn from each other, we can share strategies, but we also have to remake those strategies and make them specific to our own time and place. So they're not shamed of learning, of making mistakes. I think I'll just end here with returning to this point, which I think is really crucial, that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for the common good, for what I call the many. They wanted to value all labor, and that included domestic labor, women's and men's labor in the home. But they wanted to value labor, whether those people were called employees or not, whether they were waged or not. And I think that that kind of expansive vision is really important to us today, as well as the sense of recognizing and learning from each individual.
Thank you very much. Is there any question? We do have a couple of minutes, so if anybody wants to take the floor, please do. Otherwise, Dorothy, while just to wrap up, I mean, you've been looking at the feminist movements for a very long time, but looking from the lenses of the labor movement also, labor feminists. Do you think there is any change in terms of the analysis of these different strands of the feminist movements, you know, after, as I said earlier, so you had this whole generation completely disconnected from class, looking more into the language and symbolism, sometimes also called identity politics. Do you think there is any sort of a change from that sort of analysis and action that follows that analysis?
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, the movement has feminized, and that has meant that the labor movement has changed. It is in many places, in particular, more open to the contributions of women and of all people of all different sorts, and to understanding that we have to build a movement that's based on difference and that unity is strongest when it comes out of that. At the same time, I think the labor movement needs to feminize more. And what I mean by that is not just in terms of numbers or leadership, but in terms of valuing what has historically been associated with the female realm. I'm not saying this is a biological thing that all women are this way or all men are that way, but I'm saying there's certain values that have been associated with women that have been devalued in part because they're associated with women. And I think the labor movement needs to feminize more or demasculinizing by claiming those values as important. They're the values of care. And this is so important today, I think, as cruelty is on the rise. And there's a challenge to the importance of care. There's also a challenge to the notion that we are all dependent on each other, interdependence and cooperation. And I think one of the things that has come out of the women's movements and working women's movements in particular is this challenge to a culture of individualism. Basically, because women historically have been more assigned to caring labor, they understand that we're all interdependent, that we will all need care, and that we don't accomplish things just as individuals. We're dependent on other people, that collective bonds are important for our survival, that cooperation is important. So I think the labor movement needs to feminize more in that sense, in terms of putting those values forward. In terms of the women's movement, I think that the women's movement today is increasingly connected to other larger social movements. The labor movement, for example, for a long time in the US, women organized primarily separately into independent, all women's movements. But now increasingly they organize with men in the labor movement, in the civil rights movement, in various kinds of movements about the environment. And so those pendulum swings that I see throughout history of organizing separately or organizing more in mixed sex, I think we're in a different swing at the moment. And I do think that the women's movement has become more intersectional and more open to class issues. At least that's my hope, because as we know, class inequality among women is as great as class inequality among men.
Thank you very much. We are really at the end of the session, and I don't know, Dorothy, if you would have a few more minutes for one question that is coming from our live stream on Facebook. There is lots of appreciation for your work. I'm particularly interested in examples of labor feminists in construction worker union. Also, I'm interested in examples of union-sponsored childcare centers that particularly support women construction workers. It's a question from a comrade from UK, I think, Daniel. Yes, please.
Okay, can you repeat that? She's interested in
It's
women
a
in
he.
construction unions.
Yes, construction worker unions.
And what in particular?
Examples of union-sponsored childcare centers
Ah,
that
okay.
particularly to support women in construction sector, or perhaps it's a comrade from the US, actually.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, in the US, but this is true, I would think in many other places in different moments in time, place. women have made some strides in moving into the construction unions, in apprenticeship programs, in training. But we know there's still a very small percent of those organizations. I actually worked for a year or so in a program called Women Teachers in the Trades. And the idea there was that if we can certify women who'd been in the trades to teach an apprenticeship, that that would help transform the culture of the building trades. And we found that this was actually really effective, that when some of the young men who were becoming construction workers had women as teachers, they changed their attitudes about women's capacities. So I thought that was an interesting approach. But yes, the childcare is incredibly important. The whole issue of how we organize the paid world, how we structure it, and how we compensate it, and how we organize the household, and how we make it possible for the double day of both having paid job and unpaid job, how we lessen that double day, I think is one of the most important questions we face. The labor feminists pushed very hard, not just for equal pay and minimum wage, but for shorter hours. And one of the things they argued is that women, yes, should enter paid work, but the world of work has to transform to make it more possible for women and for everybody who has family responsibilities. The world of work is set up as if you don't have a family. That's the expectation. But we do have families and we do have people that are dependent on us. So they wanted a shorter work day and not just paid vacation, a month, that would be great, or shorter work week. Those were called lumps of leisure. And actually, that was what the labor movement pushed for a long time. Walter Reuther and the UAW call those lumps of leisure. But I argued there was a gendered politics of time and that women too wanted shorter work hours, but different kinds of shorter work. They wanted a 6-hour day because that would make it easier for them to combine wage work and household responsibilities. So yes, they wanted childcare, but yes, they wanted work reorganized so they could see their own children. So we have to think creatively like that. And it's an example, again, of how we have universal demands like shorter hours, but we think in ways that accommodate the differences among us.
Well, thank you very much, Dorothy. It's been really, really interesting. Lots of food for thought. We're going to continue the conversation tomorrow on some of this relationship with in between labor and other movements now, right? Movements for racial justice and faith-based movements. So thanks everyone for participation and for the great question. Thanks again, Dorothy, and hopefully we are going to meet in other events and discussions about labor history. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good luck.